our next speaker, who is Becky Wood, Chief Executive of NISTA. Unfortunately, Becky can't be with us today. Something has called her back into the Whitehall machine. But she was desperate to get her message across, so she has recorded a short little video for us, and we will be joined on the stage shortly by one of Becky's colleagues to talk about what she has to say. But for now, please to give a sort of virtual big welcome to Becky Wood, Chief Executive of NISTA.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much to Jason and his team for inviting me today. I am so sorry that I can't be there in person, but I jumped at the chance to at least pre-record a message. As much as I don't enjoy seeing myself on film, I did want to convey how disappointed I was not to be there in such a room of rich insights, no doubt, and also some fantastically critical people across our industry gathered together in one space. Apologies again that I can't join you. I'm delighted my colleague Ed Beard should be in the room with you today, and I have no doubt that Ed will be bringing back plenty of insights from your conversation. What I did perhaps want to leave you with as you start your day was a few reflections as we come up to the 1-year anniversary for NISTA, and some observations as to where we're seeing some potential challenge and spaces for you to keep helping us, as I know that you will as a collaborative partner, which was partly why I was so disappointed not to be able to join. In terms of where we have started from and where we are at today, a number of colleagues in the room will have heard from me about the priorities I set as I came in as NISTA's Chief Executive, and the first one was and remains very much about NISTA as an organisation. We continue to focus on our transformation, we're making some great headway, but the momentum needs to continue, and that's partly because people are really central to our industry and how we can succeed collectively and individually. So I still focus quite a bit on NISTA's organisational design and where we're going to land with it. Part of that can be informed very much by our collective future as industry, and we've already learnt quite a few lessons as we evolve over our first year. In terms of industry and business priorities for me, colleagues again will have heard that I had wanted to open up with plenty of focus on the opportunity presented through NISTA's Spatial Planning Unit to keep informing government decisions on prioritisation from a place perspective. We're building some great data sets, we're thinking a lot about how we can bring together those conversations about infrastructure gaps, as well as what's available to us in informing critical decisions around new towns, in how we engage with big government policy decisions around Oxcam, and most recently in relation to the Northern Growth Strategy that the Treasury published. A really good opportunity for us to be working right across the UK. Alongside that, we continue to focus on some of the thinking that will begin our pathway on the social infrastructure roadmap. And there's quite a common theme there for me in terms of data and the importance of digital data in particular in understanding both our legacy asset base and where we need to go for our future assets. So there's plenty of thinking happening there, but it's a great example of somewhere where you might all be having conversations today in relation to how we can tackle asset maintenance of the future, how we think about the data that we already have in terms of the legacy asset base, and also thinking about resilience, which I'm sure is on many of our minds collectively. I'm delighted to say that we're approaching the second iteration and publication of our dynamic infrastructure pipeline. And again, that is a little bit about data, but it's much more so for me about skills and how we can work with industry and across colleagues like yourselves to think about our industry of the future, to understand gaps in skills in terms of how we share capability and how we build capability to make sure we can get things delivered. Alongside that, we've really been thrilled by the engagement levels back from colleagues such as yourselves and also from investor groups as we think about the critical metrics and characteristics of different projects across that pipeline to make sure that we are opening our doors, just as the government wants to the investment we need to make all of this come together. In terms of broader discussions across government, it wouldn't be wise of me not to have mentioned the fact that, of course, we remain focused also on removing barriers to delivery and maintaining momentum. There's a lot there in some of the great decisions we've seen, I hope, over my first year in terms of the landing of Sizewell C's transaction, seeing some great recent outcomes on the new hospitals programme, some great decisions coming out for Lower Thames Crossing. We must, of course, maintain that momentum, and part of NISTA's job, as well as being collaborative, is to make sure that we're supporting the government honouring its commitments and moving us all forward. So I've been, as I say, delighted to see some of those great milestones of progress, and we are very focused on ensuring that continues. It would be remiss of me not to mention in that context the fact that we're also, of course, still focused with Lower Thames Crossing, but also with colleagues at Euston on how we work on the private financing models available to us to keep these things going. Lots of my team are also engaged on the new the neighbourhood healthcare PPP work that we're now bringing out to market over this coming year, and also on public sector estate decarbonisation. I know the great work of ICG's Decarb Group is probably going to be very helpful to us across the piece, but it's also very welcome for me that we can partner with ICG and colleagues such as you to make sure that we're really informed in the way we're taking all of that forward. As I say, I'm very sorry not to be with you, particularly with such a rich room. I'd love to hear some insights back through Ed, but of course also take another opportunity through Jason and his team to engage when I can. Thank you for offering the opportunity to share some thoughts, and enjoy your day.
So I'm really pleased that here, live and in person, our next speaker, and there he is, I will welcome up to the stage, is Mark Thurston, Chief Executive of Anglian Water. Please, if you could give a big welcome to Mark, he comes up to the stage. Mark, welcome up.
Give me some water.
No, it's up to you, mate. You can stand up. Mark, of course, currently, recently, Chief Exec of Anglian Water, but it comes with a plethora of big infrastructure delivery, High Speed 2, Crossrail, London 2012, you name it, Mark has been there and helped deliver it. So it's really great to have you with us today to give us that perspective from the top of the client organisations to share with us how you see the world shaping up in this 10-year infrastructure plan era. So welcome, Mark.
Cool. Thanks, Mark. If you could do me a favour, just pour me half a glass of water.
Yep, I can definitely do that.
50 minutes. Well, look, good morning, all, and thanks, Mark and Jason, who I know very well. I had some time working with the ICG. Thanks, Manny. With the ICG in my last job. So, as Mark said, I'm Chief Executive of Anglian Water. And for those of you that don't know me, I've sort of looked around, seen a few familiar faces. I just arrived via the back entrance just to avoid any particular escapades this morning. One of my colleagues from the water sector attended a utility conference back just before Christmas and was stopped in reception and missed his keynote slot by about an hour and a half. So I didn't want that to happen this morning to make sure I was on time. Those of you who know what I'm talking about will understand. If you don't, speak to Becky Harrison, my Chief of Staff, afterwards. She'll understand. She'll explain all. So yeah, I think just to sort of frame this, if you don't know me, I've had the privilege of working in our sector now for the lion's share of my career. And for the last 20 years, I've been lucky enough to be involved in some of the most iconic and significant projects that we've seen in our country. I was one of the programme managers in the delivery partner on London 2012. I actually ran the programme partner on Crossrail for a number of years. I was then regional MD for a company called CH2M, which is now part of Jacobs. So I ran a big 3,500 consulting business in the world of sort of mostly infrastructure. And for 6.5 years, as Mark said, I worked for the government as the chief exec at HS2. So what I'm going to do sort of for the next 10, 15 minutes is two things. Really, first share what I see as some of the biggest challenges facing our infrastructure sector in the context of Anglian Water. And this is a job now I've had for some 20 months. And then secondly, share some personal reflections of what I consider to be, and there are many, but the ones that I consider relevant today, the critical success issues in delivering large-scale infrastructure in our country based on that experience of the last 20 years. As we heard from Becky, the government's published a 10-year infrastructure plan. It has bold ambitions to unlock growth across our country, whether it's building roads, rail, energy, major city projects, along with the target for 1.5 million homes in this parliament. And much of this requires water. So we need to come together as a sector, certainly as a water sector, to sort of turn on the taps for growth in this country. In the next 5 years, in AMP8, the water companies across the UK will spend £104 billion bringing forward new reservoirs, deliver treatment centres, pipes, flood defences. And this is all to cope with population growth, environmental protection and climate change. Again, some of the themes that you've heard already from Jason and Becky. And at Anglian Water, our business is expanding to meet that opportunity. So while maintaining the services that our customers rely on, supplying clean water and taking away and recycling used water every day, we must also build major new infrastructure that both our region and the UK more widely needs to be resilient. And before I get into that, I think it'd be useful just to put a little bit of context around our business in the region that we serve. We're the largest water company by geographic area in England and Wales, predominantly all of the east of England. Every day we put between 1.2 and 1.3 billion litres of fresh water into supply. So we're in the public health business, and that serves about 7 million people. So somewhere around 15% of the country's population rely on our product effectively. And the east of England, something I've got to know and understand over the last 20 months, has its own unique challenges. We receive the lowest amount of rainfall, which puts us at risk of drought. We're also very low-lying and flat, which makes us prone to flooding. 75% of the land is used for agriculture, and we're home to some water-intensive industries like food processing, defence, and green energy. And as a region, we're growing. We have 4 of the fastest growing cities in the country: Cambridge, Peterborough, Milton Keynes, and Northampton. And it's one of the largest regional contributors to now the UK economy, supporting around 3.3 million jobs, with a growth forecast actually which is almost comparable to London. And those growth ambitions can be evidenced by a number of major infrastructure projects in our patch, and Becky referred to some of those. Sizewell C, of course, industrial transformation up on the Humber Bank. I was up in Grimsby just at the beginning of January, huge amount of activity on the Humber Bank there in sort of industrial growth. The Oxford-Cambridge corridor, Universal Studios at Bedford, East West Rail. We've got plans in the region for some 15 new data centres and thousands of new homes. And again, all of this requires water. And given the concentration and scale of growth in the region, our water infrastructure, frankly, needs to keep up with that demand. So over the next 5 years, we have our biggest investment programme to date. That's about £11 billion, which is more than 50% than we had in the last 5-year AMP7 period. And it will see us as Anglian Water progress 2 new reservoirs, hundreds of miles of modern pipes, upgrade our water recycling infrastructure, and create nature-based solutions like wetlands. And once complete, our strategic interconnector of over 300 kilometres of new pipeline will enable us to bring some 265 million litres of water a day from the north, where we've got more water in our region, further south, where we're much drier. And we put this project in motion about 10 years ago, so I'd take very little credit. And Jason Dowell's in the room, Andy you're going to hear from later, and that allows us to sort of boost a resilient water supply for the region. And our new reservoirs, one in Lincolnshire, one in the Cambridge Fens, also represent a once-in-a-generation set of investments. There have been no new major reservoirs built in this country for 30 years, and alongside securing future water supplies, the reservoirs will create environmental and social benefits as well. We see this at the existing reservoirs, for example, at Rutland, providing amenities for local communities to enjoy biodiversity and help habitat restoration. And these projects have multiple phases and are very complex and are scheduled to come into supply in the 2030s, subject to funding and planning decisions. And this sort of leads me on to probably the first challenge as I see it, which is we need a new regulatory model for nationally significant infrastructure projects. The Planning and Infrastructure Act represents an opportunity to streamline and modernise planning for major projects. And our experience shows that we need more predictable timelines, better alignment between regulators and stakeholders, clearer designations of nationally significant infrastructure, and planning processes that match the urgency of both climate and growth. And the government's reform of the water sector comes at the right moment. We believe that to succeed, the regulatory reset must be bold, and in DEFRA's white paper, which we just saw in January, we started to see the alignment of what the industry has been asking for some time. Firstly, a recognition that the importance of investability from the private sector. Investor confidence is crucial for a growing sector and a growing country. The more risk investors perceive, we have 5 investors at Anglian, the more expensive it becomes to fund the infrastructure the country needs. And certainly, Becky, I think, would be the first to say, and Ed will probably echo this, that we can't continue to rely on taxpayers to pick up the burden for infrastructure. Secondly, the commitment to forward-looking asset health metrics and statutory resilience standards. The thing that probably keeps me awake most in this job is the condition of our assets. It's been a fundamental lack of investment in our asset base over the last 25 years. That's just to deal with both the growth, but also to ensure resilience to climate change. And then finally, to actively promote the specified infrastructure projects legislation around water and wastewater projects. Some of you heard of the sort of SIPA model. That was something that's been tried and tested very successfully on Tideway. But now, we've now seen draft copies of the government's transition plan, and there are some promising signs of leadership from them in terms of the government making some hard decisions, but we need to see this followed through to create a new regulatory environment. And we must mirror this reset in government, but also in our business too, and take this opportunity to deliver better outcomes for our customers, our stakeholders, and our regulators. Some of you only last week may have seen a programme on national television about the water sector over 3 parts, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday on Channel 4, which has added to the debate around the relationship between water companies like us, Anglian regulators, and our customers. And continuing to build that trust, being open, transparent, and accessible, making our customers feel heard by acting on their concerns, is fundamental to our long-term success. And 2 other critical challenges, again, Becky touched on these, that are important, are creating the right partnerships and supply chain capability, and ensuring we have the right talent pipeline to carry us into the future. At Anglian, again, I take no credit, but it's been has a well-established alliance model, which gives us specialist knowledge and expertise to deliver. The At1 Alliance, which many of you here would have heard of, I think Dale's going to lead a session later on Project 13, of which the At1 Alliance has been seen as a bit of an exemplar, has been really a national benchmark for collaboration, shared incentives, innovative delivery, and our approach has been held up in government's construction playbook. And we will continue at Anglian to work with our partners to improve productivity, streamline project delivery, and embrace innovation as we focus on cost, time, and carbon. Many of the things that you heard from Jason are at the heart of why ICG exists. So I'm looking forward to hear a bit more about that from some of the other speakers today. But we also need to think about the workforce of the future. We all face a labour challenge with a competition for engineering, digital, and environmental skills and talent from every corner of the infrastructure arena. And we're working with the government, industry, and regional partners to build a long-term skills pipeline for the major infrastructure needs in the east of England, including working with Sizewell C and some of those other regional projects. And our priority is strengthening capability across the east of England with Skills England. And I think working harder, we have an opportunity to do a number of things. Inspire the next generation, offer flexible, meaningful careers, prioritise well-being and safety, invest in training, apprenticeships and career transitions, and reflect the diversity of the communities we serve. The scale and scope of what we're planned over the next 5 years at Anglian and the decades beyond means we do need to start thinking differently. By 2030, 2 new reservoirs will be well underway. Our region will be fully smart metered, and we will have much greater insight into asset health and performance. Artificial intelligence, in particular, it presents a huge opportunity for us, and we remain open to discovering how that technology can help us continue to develop our business. And as I said in my opening remarks, I feel blessed that I've got to work with and continue to work in this critical sector for our country. And when I reflect on my experience of infrastructure over the last 20 years, there are 4 things that I think are critical for our success. Firstly, is the political climate and environment. Sir John Armitt, who many of you know or would have heard speak, chair of the National Infrastructure Commission as was, once said that you simply cannot decouple, at an event like this, you cannot decouple infrastructure and politics. And frankly, I fully subscribe to that assessment. Having seen, by way of example, the way politicians lined up behind London 2012 in comparison to some of the challenges that we faced along the line of route on HS2 frankly, highlight just what it means to get the politics right. Secondly, culture and capability matter much more than I think we probably give credit to. I think the conditions created between the Olympic Delivery Authority and the CLM consortium of delivery partners, and also the calibre and experience of the people involved, were, in my view, a significant factor in the success of that programme. At HS2, in the early days, we did a huge amount of work on capability to demonstrate to government that we, as their delivery body, we were competent to lead the programme, we could be trusted. So we worked hard to create a sense of purpose and culture with the organisation, such that under resilient and difficult circumstances, we could show that we could deliver. And I've taken much of that learning, as Jason and Becky from my team will know, into Anglian Water as we get ourselves match fit for the future. Thirdly, it's what I would loosely call sort of governance and the controls environment. And I think this is really important, particularly on the biggest of projects. It's an essential dimension to focus on throughout the whole project lifecycle, how decisions get made, who makes them, how authority is delegated, and how the governance framework creates the conditions for project delivery success. And again, for me, a critical factor. And then finally, coming back to Sir John Armitt's point about infrastructure projects that ignore the environment that they exist, frankly, are going to struggle to be successful. And including all those stakeholders who are impacted by our work. In my view, we're doomed to fail if we ignore the unions, local and national media, communities or NGOs. We will not be successful in the infrastructure sector if we don't win the hearts and minds of those affected by our work. So with every pipe we lay, every reservoir we build, we need to remember why we're doing it and who for. For us at Anglian, it's about strengthening the region we serve, protecting the environment, and ensuring customers and communities are the ones who benefit the most. Thanks very much. Back to Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much, Mark. That's absolutely brilliant. And so we've heard from Becky's perspective on the national picture, Mark's view from frontline delivery. Now we've just got a bit of time to explore how those worlds meet with a little bit of a Q&A. And Becky, of course, isn't here with us today, but Ed has joined us as Becky has trailed. So please give a welcome to Ed Beard, who's joining us up on stage now, who leads on a number of NISTA's policy areas. Whilst Ed comes up, anyone standing at the back, if you want to come, there's loads of chairs here at the front. If you want to just mingle through and take a seat, feel free. You know, we won't sort of judge you or anything, or ask you any nasty questions as you come forward. That's cool. Yeah, thank you, Ed, for joining us. Perhaps just keep for Jill and say just hello and say just a little bit about yourself, just so we.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. So I'm Ed Beard. I don't know if I'm the monkey and Becky was the organ grinder, but I'm here to try and answer some of the questions, but certainly, as Becky said, take away sort of the concerns and the ambition of the room as well. So I'm Ed Beard. I was in the National Infrastructure Commission before we were rolled into NISTA. I was looking after, funnily enough, DEFRA's sort of portfolio of economic infrastructure, so floods, water and waste, so very much sort of thinking about water in the NIC context. And interestingly, IPA colleagues who wouldn't have thought about water as much, because it wasn't government spend, suddenly find themselves somewhat more focused because of the challenges of delivering on water. So suddenly, sort of you can see the benefit of bringing the two organisations together. But I look after those sectors, but now also I'm looking at social infrastructure as well, which was another good sort of roll-in of all the infrastructure sectors. So as part of the 10-year plan, we want to look at infrastructure across the piece, which allows us to answer sort of some of those challenges of skills and resource, but also how you plan all of these things in a place to fit together.
Great. Well, you're most welcome here, Ed. And it is great to see that sort of relationship building between NISTA and the ICG. So that's fabulous. Well, what I did want to start with is just sort of reflecting on your presentation there, Mark. Is, I mean, you've now a little bit into your life in the water sector. Previously, much of your career has been in sort of transport infrastructure space. Is it too early to start sort of gauging sort of the differences between water and transport, and sort of reflecting on, the differences? good and bad? Where are you sort of seeing the sort of main kind of similarities and differences? We're predominantly transport people in the room potentially, so where's the sort of the overall sort of learnings, I suppose?
Yeah, there are many. So to try and do that justice in the time, I guess up until the end of last year, I spent 18 months sort of learning the sector and the company, changing it because we needed to change what's in front of us and running at the same time. And as I've sort of come back from Christmas, as Jason and the team know, our focus is really now all about execution. We're coming to up to the end of the first year of the AMP. I mean, I think if I come back to why I went into water and what was important for me having come out of my last job, the cultural water companies, Anglian is fantastic, but when I speak to my peers, many water companies, their employees are all customers. They're hosted in the region. They care deeply for what the water companies stand for. It certainly applies to us at Anglian. We're sort of very purpose and values led. And I think as a sort of fundamental sort of DNA of the organisation, to be given the opportunity to lead that and sort of take it into, sort of modernise it in for what we've got in front of us, has been hugely rewarding over the last 18 months. So it's been very pleasing to sort of take the experience from transportation from a leadership perspective, and as an engineer, and I'm only one of a couple of engineers of water company CEOs actually, and sort of apply that has been hugely a lot of fun, frankly, as well as learning. I think there's something about the fact that we're privately funded. It's quite different from most of my last job, and a lot of my career has been in publicly funded projects. There is no doubt a difference around sort of where you sit relative to the political agenda, political interference, the relationship with organisations like NISTA and officials in DEFRA or DFT in my last job. So there's an interesting dynamic there. I think we've been blessed in this country in the last 20 years with some big investment in infrastructure, going back to the Jubilee line, CTRL, Crossrail, of course, HS2. And I think we're seeing now, and that continues with things like Lower Thames Crossing and the A14 and stuff. And I think what we're seeing is the water sector has probably not had that level of investment. And that's now, I think we're on the sort of cusp of that for the next 20 years. So certainly those in the room have still got 20, 25 years of their career to have in this sector. My advice would be if an opportunity comes up to go into the water sector, if you think about change from transport or another part of the infrastructure arena, you do worse than go into the water sector. I think the opportunities for sort of personal and professional growth are going to be profound. But to the 4 points I made at the end there, in terms of my sort of personal reflections, many of those things apply. Yeah. So we are in a sort of highly political region. You're seeing sort of consolidation of sort of regional and local politics. We're having to interplay for skills with lots of other undertakings and big sort of complex endeavours, not just ours, but say I talked about Sizewell, the Oxford-Cambridge corridor, the growth. You go into some of the places where we work and there are cranes everywhere. So making sure we've got the supply chain set up, we've got the right client capability in Anglian is going to be important. So lots of crossover, but lots of new stuff, and I guess that's the fun of it.
Yeah. And I think, it's really, it's, you just touched on it there, and it's been mentioned a couple of times already, just the capability piece. I mean, there is in this 10-year strategy, there is so much to be delivered. Water companies turning themselves much more into delivery organisations than they have been for a while. The big energy programmes kicking off, also happen to be in your region. Yep. And Becky mentioned it there. I mean, Ed, I guess key thing gluing it all together is the pipeline and consistency, and obviously the aspiration for a dynamic pipeline. Is it fair to ask you how that's developing, how that's coming along?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I think Becky mentioned the second iteration of the pipeline is due for publication soon, which I hope shows it is a live thing. It's not something that was published, well done everyone, and off everyone goes to something else. It really is there. It is something we want to develop. She also mentioned the spatial team, and I think we've mentioned that there is no infrastructure without politics, that quote from Sir John Armitt, that you need to be operating in an environment. And I think the role of the NIC and now NISTA was to bring some of the evidence so that politicians can understand what the challenges are, what trade-offs maybe they need to be making at their level as well as at a more local level. So I think the spatial work is really important, and I think we're already seeing some of the benefits of how that's helping to shape decisions, identify priorities, knit together all that ambition on growth and housing with some of the challenges of developing infrastructure, with perhaps not always having the sight of what the growth challenge was and how you plan for that. So I think the knitting together is really starting to happen. And I would expect that the 10-year strategy is supposed to be refreshed in 2 years, so in 2027 now, not even 2 years. And again, that should be a live document helping set that large context and again, knitting together. And I would hope to see much more that it's the result of a lot of the knitting together that's been happening, as opposed to what you could accuse it of being a little bit of the spending review and the ambition in departments already and what's happening. Hopefully next time it's helping to shape what's happening rather than just the sort of shopping list from all my colleagues in departments of what's going on in different areas, but really starting to see it being identifying the challenges and bringing them together so decisions are made in a real context, not in isolation.
That sounds very encouraging. I mean, here we are, we don't really even have a national transport strategy, do we? Let alone a national infrastructure strategy, which so an evolving strategy for this has to be encouraging. And I guess one of the real interesting challenges, as you talked about there, Mark, is yes, you're gearing up to be a major kind of delivery organisation. All the water companies are. There's lots of new stuff to be delivered. But as Jason said right at the start, and you've touched on, the resilience of our existing assets to all the things coming at us in terms of increased use, climate change, age, is also a major challenge. So how do we? What's your biggest? The biggest worry, is it getting the new stuff built, or is it keeping the old stuff alive and ticking?
Well, I think we don't really get a choice. It's both, and it would be pretty daunting for the water sector to deliver what it's got in front of us. So I think AMP7 was for this sector. I looked at Jason to give me a nod, but it was about 85 billion across the 5 years, so 104, massive increase. So the water sector's in uncharted territory, and to your point, we're moving away, and the language we've been using is we're moving away from being a water company to becoming an infrastructure business. And actually, as you sort of see that progress through the next 2 or 3 AMPs, we move from becoming an infrastructure business to more be like a system operator. So when you start to connect up pipelines and reservoirs and run a water system for a whole part of the country, then you're looking at it as a whole system. And we're thinking about that already now in terms of what does it mean to the competencies and capabilities we need internally. So to take on that capital programme at the scale that's in front of us would be daunting enough if our assets were in what you would call reasonable condition. Yep. Most of our assets are not. So you have this massive backlog of sort of 20, 25 years. I mean, one of the sort of big just education points for me coming in as a consumer is just how much we take water for granted and how cheap it is. And inevitably bills are going up, and that's difficult in part, for all sorts of reasons with the cost of living, and all water companies are doing work. We in particular have got something like 500,000 customers now on what we call a priority services register, where we've got vulnerable customers where we're trying to avoid water poverty. People even can't afford to pay for the water. But a reality is I think we have got a generation's worth of work to renew many of our assets on a like-for-like basis, just for them to sustain the future. And then on top of that, to your question, we've got to continue to enhance and grow those assets to deal with climate change, resilience, growth, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a twin-track approach. We don't get the choice. It's creating some real technical issues with the regulators around how do you build and put really sort of modern assets and bolt them onto existing assets that in themselves are highly degraded. Because actually when we're going to go to do that work, we're finding that we've actually got to spend money on those existing assets just to get them up to a standard to be able to enhance them for the future. So you've got some real, financial, investable, and technical issues that, and again, we're not alone here at Anglian, but I've seen it up close, and it's the one thing that I guess sort of worries me is how we're going to reconcile these two things in the next 10, 15 years. Long after I've moved on from Anglian, but we've got to create a generation of people who are going to have to get used to dealing with that tension.
Does it feel doable?
Yeah, of course it's doable, but come back to my point, the sector needs to be investable. We've got very long-term patient investors, but they need a competitive return. They're all international investors. They have a choice about where they want to put that money, and they could put that money. So we need to make sure that the sector stays competitive in that regard, because there's no shortage of investment capital out there for the right return. We then need the capability and the supply chain to deliver it. But I think the other thing that water companies are going to have to come to terms with in particular is that much of the work over the last 20 years has sort of been done behind the fence, sort of under permitted development, and the public haven't seen us. And as Andy Alder is in the room, he'll tell you from the SPA programme, 300 kilometres of blue pipe, about 800 mil thick, it's in the photo, from Lincolnshire to Essex, you suddenly become very visible. And if you don't get your act together with stakeholders and local planning authorities and other people that you're going to interfere with, your life becomes pretty miserable. Or you make their life miserable, and those two things don't reconcile either. So, yeah, it's all eminently doable, but come back to Ed's point, government policy's got to stand behind this. The water reform bill, the way we need to put, we have 3 regulators in water, and water companies are having to juggle the demands of 3 separate regulators. Bringing them into one economic, quality and environmental regulator that can then make trade-off decisions about what's the right thing to do for the industry is going to be an essential part of the mix. So government's got its role to play as well.
So Ed, do you see NISTA, is it sort of feeling that, and getting grasping this dual challenge of, keeping the old stuff going as well as delivering all this new stuff? Is that really understood, the challenge, don't you think?
I'd like to say it's understood in NISTA, whether we communicating that. There's quite a lot of work looking at maintenance of existing assets, and that's both, because obviously there's no resilience if the assets aren't kept just up to spec, let alone of the challenges they might face, because that's your first sort of line of resilience. So I think there is recognition of that. I think there has been, particularly in water, the luxury of keeping bills cheap and everybody patting themselves on the back of achieving that in the past, and it's how we've now got a huge increase and possibly further to pay for the ambition going forwards. It's understanding that affordability, but you will not get the resilience and you will not get the new stuff and the growth without the will to pay for it. So I think it's about how NISTA can bring the evidence into the room so that politicians can be confident in the choices they're making and confident in supporting the projects that they support so that they do understand that. And I think NIC, again, proved its worth there, managing to transition from a conservative regime into the Labour regime so that politicians could see the challenges and the problems. There was learning, I think, in terms of delivery on some of the planning reform that really was starting, again, in the previous administration, but has continued into the present one and hopefully accelerated. So I think there is an understanding that you've got to change. I think NISTA, as Becky sort of didn't quite observe, but we've been doing a lot of thinking about what is the role of NISTA, but actually that then puts a challenge to what's the role of my Treasury colleagues, because we're part of Treasury, and other parts of government in supporting and helping with the delivery of this stuff. And NISTA is definitely supporting departments. They own the policies, they own most of the levers to help with support, thinking of DEFRA, both on the environment side as well as sort of water policy. And it's supporting those colleagues as well, rather than NISTA coming in with all the answers. We have a lot of skills, but we don't have all the answers.
Great, thank you. My last question to you, Mark, is just as we move into the next session, and it's been really interesting hearing Becky talk and then yourself talk, and resiliences we've talked about a fair amount, but we haven't mentioned the word carbon and carbon reduction. And if we went back 5 years, that was a big topic of conversation at events like this, and we appreciate it's hard and priorities evolve and change. And I guess just, honestly, where does carbon reduction now sit for yourself as an Anglian CEO, but I guess other infrastructure CEOs you talk to and sort of bounce off?
I think, firstly, I think the question's a bit narrow. In carbon, I think it's one factor. Yeah. We're in the environmental management business, right? So we can't ignore the sustainable impact of our work. It just doesn't sort of wash, and it's enshrined in our purpose. So all water companies have sort of got this sort of, to some extent, front and centre. But there's no doubt the sort of political mood on this has shifted. And as I said, I think as we bring our regulators together through the reform, the mindset of that regulator is going to need to be about trade-offs. So what is the environmental destination we want to create in any particular geography? And I think the place-based thinking that's coming out of NESTA is super important for that. And I think water companies have got an important role to play there. What can we afford? Yeah. and what are the other demands on our asset base to serve, in our case, sort of public health and water supply. So I think this thing's going to continue to have its place. I agree. It seemed to be the thing that dominated all conversations in infrastructure not long ago. I know Rachel's leading a session this morning. I mean, it's interesting. It was in the Times yesterday. It's an 80% of Gen Zs would consider sort of eco-friendliness as a factor in selecting a partner. You know, I've got two girls, 27 and 29, and they are highly tuned to the sort of the environment. My youngest in particular is highly tuned to sort of her environmental impact in terms of the clothes she wears, how she travels, what she eats, and that's a generational thing. So those of us at this time, those of us at sort of my end of our career, if we ignore this issue, we do at our peril, because I think we're going to find ourselves being very irrelevant to the people we're ultimately going to serve it for, which is our kids and our grandkids. But at the same time, I think we need to see it as a trade-off amongst some other demands where financial and human capital are also in the mix.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for setting that out honestly and clearly. And thank you more broadly, Mark, for coming and just talking and sharing us your perspectives. It's absolutely fascinating. As always, talking to you, we could talk for hours, but that's all we've got time for. If you could thank Mark for being with us today, that's amazing. Thank you very much, Mark.